Society right here on SABC News, independent and impartial. I'm your host, Naledi Mulo, and thank you so much for joining us on this very special broadcast of the show. As you can see, we are not in studio today. We are, in fact, at Wits University in Johannesburg, where we are bringing you the 18th Africa Investigative Journalism Conference. It is essentially investigative journalists that have gathered from 42 of the African countries, having convened here in South Africa to attend the conference that is led by Professor Anton Harber. Critical discussions on the role of investigative journalism in tackling the many challenges that the continent faces, but also the kind of support and continuous work that needs to be done to see the growth of investigative journalism on the continent. So remember, throughout the show, we are taking your tweets. Those are, send them to hashtag SABC Media and Society. Let's not waste any time and get into our very first discussion, where we'll be speaking to journalists, but also special today because we also have a live audience of young journalism students at the university who will also be giving us some of their questions and curiosities and perhaps what they expect from the world of investigative journalism as they prepare themselves to enter the media world. But we're going to start the discussion talking about reframing Africa. It's an important one because the framing of the continent in many investigative journalistic stories by mainstream media, many have said, has unintentionally perpetuated the same single story of a corrupt continent with a poor leadership. Some have even said that the harmful and stereotypical narratives that persist globally about Africa come from some of the work that are done by journalists here on the continent. So we're going to talk a little bit about the role of journalists in reframing the narrative of Africa. And for that, I am now joined by Ms. Moki Makura, who is the executive editor of Africa No Filter. I'm also joined by Ms. Ndu Oko, who is the editor of Bird Agency. And we've got some more speakers as well joining us in the audience. But let's start with you, Ms. Makura. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Really, really appreciate it. I think let's start off with the big question about investigative journalism, the role it plays in changing the narrative of Africa. I know that Africa No Filter, for the most part, does a lot of work in talking about that image of Africa and how the world views us. How does investigative journalism impact the way people view our continent?
I think it's a great question, because if you think about the investigative stories that we know about, and if you look at South Africa, the Zondo Commission, if you look at the Gupta leaks, they're all stories that feed one of the key frames that we've identified, which is corruption. The other one is poor leadership. So they're actually 5 key frames that we've identified that most stories about Africa are told. One is poverty, it's disease, it's poor leadership, it's conflict, and it's corruption. Investigative journalism tackles 2 of them, corruption and poor leadership. So investigative journalism has a big role to play in holding power to account. So we're not saying don't tell these stories, but they are not the only story of the continent. And these stories have an impact. They have a huge impact, because globally people see a continent that is full of corrupt leadership, that is full of just, people just not doing the right thing, that Africa is broken because we're forever in need of being fixed. And I think that journalism has a role to present a better picture, a balanced picture, a picture that shows the entirety of what Africa or what South Africa is.
Yeah, perhaps it's interesting actually to think about whether or not that idea that investigative journalism taints the picture of Africa, if that view itself is coming from our leadership that want to keep up this pretty picture that for the most part isn't the reality on the ground. What do you say to that, Lou?
Well, I think that there are various realities that exist on the ground. Unfortunately, the realities that we should be feeding off going into the future and even in our present then are not seen. And if you want to change a frame, you don't change the picture, you refocus the lens. And that's what we're asking, and that's what we are doing with the Bird Specialized News Agency. That's exactly what it is. That we are saying, yes, there are terrible things that happen. There is poor leadership, there is corruption, but in probably equal, if not more measure, there are other things that are happening. There is development, which begets itself. There is good leadership in many areas that unfortunately do not get the focus on them. And so we're saying, shine the spotlight on those things that happen, which are positive. The narrative that has been spun for too long. And it has been center stage for too long. And we're saying that this can shift. and it can change, because we know that if one sees you in a positive light, the opportunity to then become better then presents itself in greater magnitude. And that's what we're saying, shift the focus so that you can change the frame.
I'm keen to talk about the state of investigative journalism, though, on the continent. I think one thing that's special about a conference like this one, when you have 42 African countries represented and investigative journalists that are bravely forging ahead with work that, for the most part, sometimes can be life-threatening for them. But to have 42 countries represented is encouraging, right? I want to talk a little bit about that. What is misunderstood about investigative journalism on the continent, that it does in fact exist?
No, I think investigative journalism absolutely, definitely exists. And I think there's a lot of stories that have broken things, that have identified, corruption and things like that. But I think there is this perception that investigative journalists have to focus on stories around poor leadership, around corruption. It's almost as if there is nothing else. And the problem with the continent is that we have too many examples of that to show. It almost becomes, it's another story. It's another investigative, story on corruption. There was some research that was done in Kenya by an organization called the Deep, and what they did is they looked at 16 media outlets in Kenya and the content they put out on social media. And what they discovered was that the top 70 stories, the top most engaged with stories, were not stories of investigative, journalism or politics. It was soft, human interest stories. The problem is that people are tired of sad and bad news, because there's a sense of, what do we do with it? What do we do when we find, the local council or the hospital has, taken all the money? There's a sense of, there's nothing more we can do. And when you keep getting bombarded with those stories, it leads you to this thing called news fatigue, which is a real thing. People are turning off the news in their droves. Yeah. So does that mean that investigative journalists stop doing those stories? Maybe not. I think there's definitely a room for those stories. But what I think, there's an opportunity to use those investigative skills to go and find better stories. Or to change the focus of those stories away from the bad and terrible leaders to, a good example we have is this BBC story, which was a story on, it was called, what was it called? It was called, I can't remember what the story was called, but it was, Racism for Sale. Yes. And I don't know if anybody saw it, but it was a story where the journalist, who was a UK-based journalist working with a Malawian journalist, identified some videos which had been this Chinese person had gone into villages in Malawi and was filming young kids, and he was teaching them Chinese, supposedly, but what he was teaching them to say was, I'm stupid, I'm evil, I'm ugly. It was just, and then he was putting that stuff on social media in China to get likes, and he was getting a huge amount of likes. So what they did is they found the village. They actually narrowed it down, because it could have been anywhere in Africa. They didn't say where it was. They found the village, and they went there, they identified the guy. They found him. And it just empowered those young kids again, because the parents were angry that this is what this Chinese man has been teaching my kids. Right? So I'm just saying that was pure investigative journalism. Yeah. But it came up with a totally different story. It was actually an empowering story that, hey, you can't treat us like that as Africans. Yeah. So I'm just saying there's another role. It's not always poor leadership and corruption.
Can we get into more of those examples? I quite like listening to those examples of what investigative journalism has been able to achieve, right? I mean, we know that here in South Africa, we talked about this extensively, especially here on Media and Society, that it was the work of investigative journalism that brought us the Gupta leaks, that eventually led to the public protector investigating, that eventually led to a state capture commission, and now recommendations from the commission, according to the president, going to be implemented for accountability for maladministration, malfeasance, and state capture in the country. Quite recently, the Phala Phala saga really being looked at extensively by the media, and that's a collaboration between investigative journalists in South Africa and in Namibia. Great examples of what investigative journalists have been able to achieve. Other examples that stand out for you?
For sure. I mean, I think of many, and we know that the brain drain, or what people want to call modern day slavery, still exists, and that there are many who go out from Africa to the Middle East to look for work. There was a story that was done in Kenya undercover, again, investigatively, to find out what was really happening between agents and those who would look for work in the Gulf countries, and finding out the whole network that was between who would get a bribe and who would bribe state commissions to be able to get their licenses, to be able to send people out. But it was a story of one girl who was followed from here. She went to one of the Gulf countries, came through to find out who had bribed whom. This whole story came back to the government, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, until we get to the point whereby there was so much public outcry, there was so much backlash, and there was so much crying out basically for saying, look, provide jobs here, or at least provide a framework through which, if people are going out to work, make sure that they are protected by their government, that state sovereignty is protected, and that people do not go and be sold into slavery. Today, what we have, or what is existent now in Kenya, is that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through this horrible story of bribery, of corruption, of modern day slavery, is that now a commission is being set up where if you leave the country, you can be assured of protections by your government. Had it not been done, we probably would not have seen something like that. So they took the positive side of it to say, look, something ought to be done, not people are going and it's slavery and they die. But then what happens thereafter?
Right.
There's opportunities.
Yeah, you've got to bring the attention to it. And I want to bring some attention to our audiences. We've got young journalists young journalism students from Wits University. Please give yourselves a warm round of applause. We've got about 8 of them in the room, or about 10. Give yourselves a round of applause, guys. And we also have with us some other speakers that I think will help us with some of these examples of great work being done. I'm joined as well by Mr. Abdulateef Abubakar Jos, who is the editor-in-chief of Solace Base, doing incredible work in the space of investigative journalism. And we also are going to be hearing from Ms. Doreen Wainaina, who is with Code for Africa. But I want to start with you, Mr. Abubakar Jos, and talk about some of the examples that you have been investigating with Solace Base. Here in South Africa, we've had the challenge of, during the COVID-19 pandemic, money simply going missing. Journalists really saying, what happened to the COVID relief funds? And I believe you've been digging into a similar story in Nigeria as well.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and to latch on what my colleagues have been talking about. What we need to understand in the first instance is what are the functions of a journalist. Because what I would talk about this is the fact that part of the responsibilities of journalists is to set agenda. And with not reporting about the authorities alone, with reporting about what is happening in the society. So in as much as we're talking about investigative journalism, it's not just the negative part of it that we should be looking at. We should look inward and celebrate even those that are supposed to be celebrated. There was a story in Nigeria, I'm sorry to digress a bit, there was a story in Nigeria not quite long of about a 10-year-old mathematician genius. We normally refer to her as a calculator, a human calculator. She dropped out of primary school, I think at the age of, she was in primary 2 or 3, but the parent couldn't afford it anymore, so she had to be embarking on street begging, street hawking. But along the line, some people discovered this lady, this young girl, that when you do some little calculations, before you're through with it, she gives you the answer. So she's a genius. And that was how we brought her out. And as I speak with you now, one of the United Kingdom agencies have taken up the responsibilities of our education up to university level. You understand? The parents were so happy that so the media can do this.
Yeah.
So it was part of the work of the media. So when we talk about reporting the negative side at the same time, what we're doing now, moving forward a bit, is what we call solution journalism. It is not only to report the negative part, but what is the way out? For instance, there were cases of mismanagement. In Nigeria, lawmakers are entitled to what is called constituency project. Constituency project, fund are set aside, is for the lawmaker to recognize and say, look, I want a hospital in my community, and things like that, and they nominate contractors and what have you. But unfortunately, they nominate themselves, their companies, in instances, or they connive with the contractors, do a shabby job, or at times the job are not even done. So when we did this in 2019, most of them that got constituency project were able to collaborate with the anti-graft agency, because the anti-graft agency decided to say, look, let's do monitoring and evaluation. Let's check out on these companies. Let's check out on this project. Do you realize that even some of them that were not again in the National Assembly were forced to now bring out the money on their own to go and complete those projects? It was part of investigative job. Because had it been we've kept quiet, nobody will have known anything. So, and it is the tenacity to a story that matters at times.
Yeah.
The tenacity, I'm sorry.
Yes,
well,
I just need to control the time.
Yeah,
so
the tenacity
I'm keen to hear
we're talking
about this
about-
490 million naira as well that you're investigating for COVID relief funds in Nigeria.
Yeah, that has to do with the Senate President. The Senate President in Nigeria today, that is Dr. Ahmed Lawal, sponsored a constituency project. The fund, I think it's about 490 million naira, which is because a dollar, as of today, a dollar is about 810 naira in Nigeria. So we're talking about close to about almost about 500. Is it 500 million? No, it's not up to 500.
500 million naira, close to, yes.
About 500 million naira. I'm trying to convert it to what is it called, to dollars, so that it can really make sense. You understand? But what I'm trying to say by and large is the fact that money was set aside as a result of COVID to provide pipe-borne water to the area. But unfortunately, the money was released, the work was not done, the contractor just decided to go to the site, took the equipment there, and pretended to be working for some time, and before you know it, they fizzle out. So what we did at that time, this issue that I'm talking about, the Senate President decided to threaten us. He decided to say that they will sue us. They sent lawyers to us to write to us. We didn't. We said we'll stay by our story.
Right.
But as we speak right now, they're going back to site.
All right, I want to quickly hear from Ms. Doreen Wainaina, just for the work that you're doing with Code for Africa, really. And you know, I think we talked earlier with Mr. Abubakar Joss about the need as well to start creating multimedia content that's accessible across the board and even accessible on our phones. Tell us about the work that you're doing and the importance of being able to have investigative journalistic work that's accessible.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I'll come back to some of the products that we as Code for Africa built. We have a tool called Pesa Yetu. Pesa Yetu started as a tool to monitor funding and how counties in Kenya, so we have 47 counties, how are they managing their funds? So this is not necessarily a bad story, because we collect all your county data from their budgets, all their CIPD data. We put it up in the system, and any journalist can access this, and this will tell you how much was spent on hospitality, how much did they spend on healthcare, how much did they spend on building infrastructure for the county that people can use? Because not every investigative story is a negative story. Sometimes we just want to find out, this is public funds. Your taxation is constantly going up. Where is my money being spent? Is it being spent where it needs to be spent? So that's one of the tools that we have. We also look at how we use social media. So for instance, in Kenya, I think most of you saw around our elections, we had a lot of investigatives around keyboards for hire, people who essentially tweet to create propaganda.
Right.
And for you to fix this situation, you have to investigate. You have to go back behind the scenes and find out, where is this content originating? Who is being paid to do this? And some of those stories have actually shown that we have what we call almost sweatshops for people who want to use Twitter to intimidate or to change their agenda. And how do they do this? They run this from small houses in Nairobi, where you're paid about $50 to send out 900 tweets an hour. So you build bots and pay other people to do it for you, to change their agenda, to change propaganda. So what we do as Code for Africa is we have our teams investigate this, work with journalists to tell these stories.
Wow.
So people are aware of what's happening behind the scenes.
And listen, but there has to be control for what happens on social media. Speaking of which, we've got some young journalists here, or young journalistic students. Any questions that you guys have for some of the people that we have in the audience? Please introduce yourself as well, and thanks so much for joining us.
Good afternoon. I am Excel Fongoma from the Tshwane University of Technology. I hear that they are balancing the story for both the positive side of investigative journalism and the negative side of it. But the fact of the matter, the investigative reporting, it's always about getting the deep of the story. There are stories that our government is invading for the journalists to be aware of and to be told to the citizens. For instance, as we speak now, Ramaphosa had cases that are not told, and then he's walking freely. Our former president, Jacob Zuma, is also out there, but then he misused the money. How about we take them and then they face the charges on the investigative stories that were made for them? The Nkandla story is still hanging out there. The Zondo Commission is now focusing on the other matters. Meanwhile, we were still looking on the answers of what happened on the things that were done, and then we're not even given answers about everything that was told to us as the citizen. Then the power of journalism, especially female journalists, are now being mocked, especially on social medias. What about their safety? Yeah. What about the future of the journalists? Yeah. Because now most of journalists are attacked on social media. Their safety is not within their hands. Right. Then what is it that the government is promising to do, or even us as journalists, what is our future?
Yeah, okay. I think that's a really great place for us to just quickly get closing thoughts in just a moment. And I think, Moki, perhaps you could also just respond to that question. I think the real question there is, how do investigative journalists make sure that they're not used by politicians to drive their agenda? That's an important one, and you can touch on the safety of journalists as well.
Look, I mean, I think it's really, safety of journalism, I think, is one of the biggest issues facing a lot of journalists on the continent, because if you tell the wrong story to the wrong person, then your actual life is at stake. And one of the things that we realize is that a lot of the time, the subject of investigative journalism is often politicians. Increasingly, there's an opportunity to target corporates as well, but often we don't target corporates because they're the ones that fund our advertising. So I feel that we need to kind of start looking at the different focuses of investigative journalism, because to your point, we can keep telling that story of Zuma and that, but you know what, it's not a role of journalists to see somebody go to jail. That is not the role of journalists. Right? Your role is to tell the story. You've put it out there. There are institutions that need to do their own job, and you need to move on to the next story.
Right. And do quickly, closing thoughts from you.
Well, definitely, and I think, yeah, that's it. The story cannot stop being told. But we're saying that at the same time as these stories are being told, that there's the other side that also does need to come out, and we can't forget that or lose focus. And we do our part to inform and educate, and sometimes entertain, but then we allow those other institutions that were instituted to get the other side of the job done.
Let's leave that conversation there. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Ms. Ndu Oko, who is the editor of the Bird News Agency, as well as Ms. Moki Makura, who is the executive director of Africa No Filter. Take a look at their platforms. They're doing incredible work. And thank you as well to Mr. Abdul Latif Abubakar Jos, editor-in-chief of Solace Base, and of course, Ms. Doreen Wainaina with the Code for Africa. Let's take a short break. We'll continue bringing you the 18th Africa Investigative Journalism Conference right here at Wits University. Welcome back. You are still watching Media and Society, and we're coming to you from Wits University as we bring you the 18th Africa Investigative Journalism Conference convened by Professor Anton Harber. And we're going to talk now about the impact of the work of investigative journalists here in South Africa. And we've seen some incredible work over previous years in the country, but also some interesting innovations and opportunities to collaborate that are still coming up, looking at some of the big stories around really looking at corruption in the country. And for that, I'm joined by Ms. Atandi Wesaba, who is the deputy editor for Mail and Guardian. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
I want to go back to the State Capture Commission, right? What's it? 300 witnesses appearing before the commission. We watched it for years on end. The reports came out, and endless pages coming out of the reports. But what people may or may not actually take into consideration is, before we even look at what's come out of those thick reports, or the thick report rather, in its various parts, you also have the transcripts, which is pages upon pages of a testimony given at the commission. And Mail and Guardian, I believe, having collaborated with data science students to go back to look at those transcripts. If there isn't an extensive work done by investigative journalism in this country, I don't think I can explain what that really is. I mean, explain what this project is. It sounds mammoth.
It's a huge project. It's a huge project. I think the Mail and Guardian has been partnering up for the past couple of years with the University of Pretoria's data science students. Professor Vukosi, he approached us, and we've been looking at different ways on how journalism can use language processing and AI to tell the stories. And one of the stories that we wanted to start delving into, of course, is the one that has been led by whistleblowers and journalists and investigative journalists across South Africa from all different newsrooms, which was state capture. We can go back to 2016 when the report came out from Advocate Tulima Donzela stating that there needs to be a commission into how vast the rot and the corruption in the country had become. And then we had 400 days of the Zondo Commission. 400 days. If there's any journalist, I still want to know, who sat through all that commission and listened and can remember everything that came out of there, I'd still like to meet that journalist. So Mail and Guardian and University of Pretoria partnered up on this to go through these thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts and seeing what other connections and other leads we could find, and to be able to start creating a platform where this information can be accessible to ordinary South Africans, to journalists from different newsrooms, to journalists from across the continent as well, because there's so many names. I think right now from the presidency stating that there are, I think, over close to 1,500 names in that were highlighted within the State Capture Commission that need to be investigated or suspended across government, across politics, across our country. So there's so much information that's there that we wanted to try and take a step further to make it accessible to people, because this is in PDFs and they're not easily read and you can't just download them quickly and find what you're looking for. So we wanted them to be much more accessible, but also to find out what other connections are there, because we still going to deal with a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, just to explain to the viewer, if you perhaps, are not familiar with the term of transcripts, what we're talking about is going back to that 400 days of testimony at the State Capture Commission, and now Mail and Guardian with the data science students from the University of Pretoria, really going through word for word, right, what was said by each of those people that took the stand. I mean, it's a massive thing that you guys are doing, and I'm sure it's not cheap. And this is the big problem that we have, not just in South Africa, but also across the continent, where it comes to the work done by investigative journalism is expensive work, is it not?
It's very expensive work, especially when we move into the world of data journalism, where you are dealing with thousands and thousands of pages, thousands and thousands of line items of expenditure and so forth. You actually need a lot of kind of technology. Some of it, of course, is free to use, but you also need some of the young people who know how to use information technology, who know how to use AI, who know how to build algorithms. This is the stuff that we're talking about that takes our journalism to the next level. For a lot of the corruption to have happened in our country and across the continent as well, a lot of very technical ways are used to siphon money out of the state, the contracts that are being used. And so journalists can't sit and trawl and manually, physically trawl through thousands of pages. So we are beginning to depend more and more on technological advancements and information systems. And that's where the partnership with the students comes in and assists us a lot. But in our newsrooms, it's not cheap to be able to get those kinds of people who are educated in that way, and also the systems themselves.
I mean, there's obviously been a need for innovative fundraising, I think, for investigative journalism across the board. But we also are joined in the room by Ms. Olukunle, who is an investigative journalist from Nigeria, winner, in fact, of the Investigative Journalist Award of the Year. Thank you so much for thank you so much for joining us. I'm keen to hear about some of the work that's being done in Nigeria, but particularly around some of the innovation around fundraising as well for investigative journalists. What's the model that you're using to continue the expensive work that you're doing in Nigeria?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to speak to some of the issues affecting investigative reporting in this part of the world. But for Nigeria, is there any particular model? I doubt if it's any particular model, but you must give it to the not-for-profit organizations who were challenged by some of the flaws in media operations in our country. Most media organizations in Nigeria are not too keen to funding investigative reporting. You know, if you consider the economics of your operation, most of them just want to sustain the operations, and the questions that you're likely going to be, asked by the management is, to what benefit is this story to our sustenance? I've had quite a number of experience in that regard in recent times. There was a time I was doing a story about how people, processing centers, use harmful chemical substances to process food in Nigeria, and I had to take it on myself to do the first part of the story without taking taking money from my company, media organization, because I believe that they may not subscribe to it. So I did the first part. So the second part was for me to test some of those food items that I found the processors using unwholesome chemical substances, and I was shocked when the management told me, no, we can't fund this laboratory test because we don't believe that, it will bring something to our profits. But I had to go out of the way to convince my managing director after about 4 months after the first part came out that we owe the society, some good in terms of telling them this concerns, issues relating to public health. And, it was also disturbed because some of those food items were things that are staple in our country. We call it fufu. And he said, no, okay, let's look at how we can manage it. So it took like 5 months after the first part for the management to approve funding for the second part, which got me an award anyway that same year. So in our part of the world, the commercial sense, overrides the importance of funding by media organizations, and that's why we mostly rely on not-for-profit organizations to fund our projects in Nigeria.
Yeah, and that's quite sad that you have to fight that way just to get the recognition. And I'm seeing some of our students here looking a little bit concerned about, wait, what are we walking into here? But you're walking into an interesting industry, and I'm keen to hear your views a little bit later on. But just to wrap up our chat, Athandiwe, this massive project that you have undertaken with the University of Pretoria, what it's taught you about the fundraising and getting the resources together. Is it really about finding those collaborations?
I think collaborations are going to be becoming much more important, I think, across the world. And I think many organizations in Europe and so forth are trying to partner up with other newsrooms as well. And I think that's something that we need to start doing in South Africa, but not just other newsrooms, other, for instance, universities or NGOs or activist groups. We need to start understanding that for us to be able to be sustainable, for us to be able to deliver the kind of news our electorate needs, we need to partner up with each other so that we are able to pull resources together and we are able to deliver those hard-hitting stories that change our country. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, Athandiwe Saba there, who is a deputy editor for the Mail and Guardian, doing brilliant work, having collaborated with the University of Pretoria's data science students, going through 400 days of the State Capture Commission inquiry and going through word for word what was said at that commission. Interesting work. We take a short break. We're back in a moment. Welcome back to Media and Society. Let's get into our third discussion as we bring you the 18th Africa Investigative Journalism Conference at Wits University. 42 African countries represented here at this conference. And you've got investigative journalists that have joined us, come together. They've talked about resources for investigative journalists. They've talked about the successes they've had in being able to break some stories. And also, they've shared some of the fears they have around, obviously, a lot of their work, exposing them, and also bringing some danger to their lives. But we wanted to shift the conversation and really start looking at the future of journalism on the continent and really how things are shifting. And I did mention that we have a few Wits University journalism students with us in the room. And I want to start with them because these young people are the future of the journalism world, and certainly they're going to be shaping how we tell stories in the future. But I want to start with you guys and say, before we get into the first discussion, how many of you guys actually first collect your news story from mainstream media? Thank you so much for coming through. Where do you see your first story when you come across a news story? Where's the first place you find it?
Instagram. Simply because I have a personalized page. So every single time I open my Instagram, I get notifications from publications that I follow, and the news is just right there when I open my page. It's the first thing that I see because the newspapers and publications release things frequently.
Yeah, and is someone else? It's interesting.
I often get my news from Twitter. I think it's to the minute, it's in the moment, and you're not only getting news from publications, but also from citizen journalists. So yeah, it's easy to access information.
Okay, one more, the gentleman behind you.
Okay, I also believe in Twitter because Twitter is informative and is mostly reliable.
Yeah. Okay, so Twitter, Instagram. Anyone on TikTok?
I'm on TikTok, so I get my news from TikTok. I know it sounds dumb, but that is probably the place I get my news the most from, and it's just because there's proof. It's video, so you can look into it further, but that is where I get my news from first.
Let me ask you this, and I want to stay with you for a little bit, right? You get your news from TikTok. Some of you guys have said Twitter, Instagram. Is this what content you want to be creating when you're done with your studies?
Yes, definitely. I think I don't really get my news and content from TV anymore as much. So I think with TikTok and Instagram and all these places, it's so accessible, first of all, and also it just reaches such a wider audience. So as I've seen now at this conference, I mean, there's people from all over, and it's so easy to just search them on Instagram or TikTok or wherever they are and see exactly what they're doing.
Okay. That's great. That means I'm out of a job very soon. Thank you very much. That's our young audience from Wits University. They're studying journalism in different fields, getting ready to join us in the newsrooms, or perhaps not. But actually, that's where we're taking our conversation now. Social media gold mining, right? Social media useful for information, for leads, and sources for investigative journalists as well. But what does the future look like for investigative journalism in the multimedia space, right, and in the digital world? And for that discussion, I am joined by Dion Wiggett, who is an investigative podcaster. Dion, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm also joined by Catherine White, who is a freelance video journalist who works on TikTok primarily.
I make TikTok videos.
That's incredible.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, right? What you do exactly and why you chose the platform TikTok. Why not come join us in the newsroom?
Well, quite honestly, I used to get a lot of people messaging me on Instagram because I'm active there and I post what I'm doing and what I'm up to. And people say, you know what, Kat, you're my only source of news. I don't watch the news, it's negative. And we're living in an information age where there's so much content out there that people just, it's so much easier. It's easier to go onto social media and easier to avoid the news. So I decided to use the platform to summarize stories, things that are difficult to understand. I mean, you can watch 10 of my TikTok videos in the same time you would have read like one news article, and it's quick, it's easy.
And you can do investigative journalism in those small chunks.
I think all journalism, to a certain extent, is investigative.
Yeah.
You have to ensure that it is factual. And in this day and age of disinformation, it's our responsibility as journalists on these platforms to ensure that we are putting the right message out there. So yes, definitely. I think anyone can go onto the platform and use it to reach people.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people on TikTok.
Yeah, I've seen this new trend, and you subscribe, and I've enjoyed what podcasters are doing. And the beautiful thing about, I think, podcasting is that you can listen to content that comes from anywhere in the world and whenever you want. And Dion, you've chosen that route for your work. Why?
I love the immediacy of podcasting, and I love how it's structured as a narrative. If you do a narrative-style podcast, podcasting used to be the future for a long time now, but I do think it's finally started to hit its stride, both in South Africa and globally, and we've started finding ways to monetize it. What I love about podcasting is it gets you into an immediate moment in a way that few other forms of journalism do. I mean, we write in the present tense. We write not in a 5 W's and H kind of, write an intro that says who, what, who, where, and why. You release one fact at a time in the most dramatic order possible. The interesting thing is the degree to which social media helps with the research for that. So, I mean, I'm the oldest 42-year-old person you will ever meet. So, I mean, I don't really believe in social media. However, as an investigator, it is invaluable. I mean, I recently investigated a water polo coach. I do a podcast called My Only Story, and we recently investigated some water polo coaches. And the way that you can find links between people and coaches and teachers by looking at people's Facebook and their Instagram. I mean, every time a new social platform comes out, it's like, oh, great, now I have to see TikTok. I still get my news from, news organizations, but I'm extremely old-fashioned. I'm a very old 42-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, but you still use the platforms to dig out the content, which is very interesting. Is that where you're sourcing some of your content as well? I mean, no.
Not necessarily, no. I do field reporting, so I do go out and I film everything by, on my phone most of the time, because that's what journalism has become nowadays.
How much of your work is driven by the fact that we do live in a society right now where our attention span is something like 3 to 4 minutes, really, and that for the most part, a lot of people just don't have the patience to sit through, a 1 hour discussion on one specific theme.
They don't even have 4 minutes to do that.
Yeah.
If you don't catch them on a video, if you make a TikTok video, you have to grab the attention of your viewer within the first 3 to 5 seconds, because it's so easy. All you're doing is scrolling. That's all you're doing. And if I don't like it, scroll next. So yes, I think it's quite challenging, but because I am fairly young, I understand my peers, and that's where TikTok came from, is people actually say to me, thanks for keeping us informed, please make more videos.
Yeah, one of the young guys here in the audience was saying that I go to social media for my news first, because it's not just the mainstream news organizations that are bringing me the information, it's citizen journalists as well. And I find that interesting, because then you've got what the digital world presents as the opportunity for us all to become content creators of some kind. But how do you then hold your clout between being an investigative journalist who is also on a podcast versus, any old Joe who decides I'm going to put together a podcast and, share my message with the world?
I think that's one of the huge dilemmas of citizen journalism. There's this scornful kind of mainstream media narrative. What makes something mainstream media is process. It means that I write something that is then checked by other people, that goes through lawyers, that is then fact-checked by sub-editors. It's a long process, because if something is in the New York Times, I know that I can trust it.
We hope that's the process we hope is happening in mainstream media. Let's say that.
But if the New York Times makes a mistake, it would own up to it. Whereas Fox News would just, tell you that more killer bees are coming from Africa. I understand that consumers have increasingly short attention spans, but at the same time, nobody struggles to watch 3 hours worth of Marvel film. I mean, Game of Thrones is more than an hour long, and in one episode extremely dark, and still people sat there trying to. I guess if the content is compelling, then I think we've got. My longest podcast was 100 minutes, and more than 80% of our listeners sat through all 100 minutes. Because if something is captivatingly presented, and if something is done with dramatic structure, then suddenly people find that their attention spans is quite malleable.
Dion, I agree with you. I agree with you that it is a challenge, yes. But look, I don't think 1 billion people watched Game of Thrones. We've got 1 billion people, more than 1 billion people on TikTok. We're talking about reach. So there is a market for that kind of thing, definitely. And but I do see, if we're talking about the future of journalism and the future of storytelling, if you're not ahead of the curve, and with this, you're going to lag behind.
Yeah, I think you guys are going to do a little tug of war, and it's understandable because you're talking, short form versus long form, but it's all really digitized, which is the future of journalism, especially when we focus on investigative journalism. And I won't let you do that,
No, we'll fight. Look, it's going to be here in classes.
We're not going to have you guys fight. But this is what I wanted to get out. Well, you've got 42 African countries that are represented at a conference like this, and you're hearing the work that's being done across the continent. I'm keen to hear if you think that there is that sort of innovation coming from the rest of the continent as well. And I actually want to bring in a guest right now, Annie Zulu, who is a freelance journalist all the way from Zambia. Annie, thank you so much for joining us. I want to hear about the innovation that is taking place in Zambia, for instance. Are we starting to see more digitized consumption of the work done by journalists? And are we starting to see journalists then also, go brave enough to go, well, I'm going to go into TikTok or I'm going to start podcasting?
Thank you very much for this great opportunity. It is an undeniable fact that the world is going digital. And journalists in Zambia taking advantage of social media platforms. For Zambia, the most used social media platform is Facebook. So there are quite a number of journalists who have come up with blogs. They are using Facebook to disseminate information. We have some who are doing TikTok videos, and we have some who are vocal on Twitter as well. Yes, so.
Yeah, very, very, very fascinating. And let's talk about what that has done then for mainstream media in Zambia. Has it meant that there's been less eyeballs for the news stations in Zambia?
Come again?
Does it mean that there's been less of an audience for the mainstream media in Zambia?
Of course. Because, how can I put it? People nowadays, they don't need to, to go home and watch a TV just for them to have access to the news, to what's going on around the world. They don't have to go out there and get a paper. They can easily use their phones, their gadgets, to access information.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's very interesting. Perhaps we should talk about monetizing it then, right? When you are able to, create a platform, have a massive following, with your podcast or your TikTok account, how do you monetize yourselves? At the SABC, I invoice and I get paid at the end of the month.
Yeah, look, that is a benefit, I think, for journalists being on the platform. But it does come with a lot of responsibility, because if your account has a lot of warnings, the chances of your account being one of those accounts that actually get monetized is slim. Words like guns, terrorist. You can't say that on TikTok. TikTok censors you, and it's very, very smart. So you have to find ways around that if you do want to monetize the platform. I've made 3 Rand on TikTok on my personal account, which is, I have like 15,000 followers on my personal account, but getting millions of views on some videos, and some of the news publishers, the TikTok videos I make for them, they're followers are way higher because of the consistency in the posting. So I think it really, and they haven't made money. So, but it's about the branding. So what is money really? The monetizing thing. The kids, we're talking about 16-year-olds who are using this platform, are going to grow up, and then they have to decide what news publisher or news outlet they subscribe to, and what brand will they trust? And there's a massive difference between being a TikTok journalist and being a television journalist. And as an editor who comes from a television background, for example, you cannot then be the editor of it. You've got to completely forget what you think, the way things should be done, and relearn. Because TikTok is real, it's raw, it's organic, the reach is insane. They need someone they can trust. And you can't direct traffic from TikTok onto your website.
No, it doesn't work.
No, because they're on TikTok. Otherwise, they would have been on your website. So you have to cater to that audience, and by being real. I think some news publishers, an example of what a publisher could do is, you'd have a very professional background. It doesn't work. You need a house, you need a home. This is me, this is real, this is raw, and drop the anchor voice, because no one's going to listen to you. It's because it's too fake.
Right.
Because we're living in a world where media is got all these agendas, and this organization's doing that, and that one's trying to get that message out. But we're human. So bring that human element to your TikTok videos as a journalist, and keep post consistently.
The anchor voice is, well, you're watching Media and Society. That's the anchor voice. I still want to come back to you, these young people over here. I hope that you guys will start podcasting and creating your own content immediately, so that by the time you finish your studies, you've already hit the ground running. It's wonderful advice, I think, for anyone who's wanting to go into journalism and to start building their credibility. That's the grandmother in me talking. But Dion, just talk to us about, the challenges around monetizing some of these platforms.
It's incredibly challenging, like with all of media for decades now. We used to have a very reliable newspaper press advert system that made big money for the media. But ever since the digital revolution from the mid-90s, it's become harder and harder to monetize the things that people want to consume, whether that is TikTok or an exceptionally fine podcast, depending on the attention span, obviously. My only story is mostly funded by donations from philanthropists. I do a podcast about teenage rape, so it's not the kind of thing that's extremely easy for brands to get behind. It's a struggle. I'm not going to say that it's anything other than that. Even getting paid by the SABC is more reliable than being a podcaster.
Yeah, well, you guys are continuing the good work, and I really hope that your platforms continue to grow, and that you're able to show these young ones as well great examples of where they can start their careers, have a real impact as well, and to give us diverse voices. I think across the continent, that's what we need, for diverse voices in the journalistic space. Thank you so much to my guest, Dion Wiggett, investigative podcaster. Thank you so much to Annie Zulu, freelance journalist all the way from Zambia, speaking to us about what we can learn from our neighbors, and as well as Catherine White, a freelance video journalist and a TikToker. To my audience, thank you. Give yourselves a warm round of applause, guys.
You can do better than that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue the conversation on social media, #SABC Media Society, the work of investigative journalists, the stories that stand out for you that have had a real impact in seeking accountability in the country. That's where we leave it. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on Media and Society.